My dad was terrified when I told him that I was coming up here. Right? My dad spent 3 years in Dundee and had a lot of time for Scotland. The name Renwick is a kind of defence, right? My dad was assumed to be a Scot, but we're not, right? We trace our family history to Cumbria, where if we trace it all the way back, we were cattle rusters. And so we stole from both the English and the Scots, right? And I hope that is enough to give me the kudos to carry on, right? It's a privilege to be able to trace names, and that's what Timespan does. It's a pull factor for this part of the world, and it's a key thing within the tourism industry here. But it's not universal. My friends from the Caribbean can only trace their name back so far, and it comes to a Brit and many times a Scot. And in the place of that past is a brutal punctuation and a deletion of a past that came before the Middle Passage. So there's something cloying that happens with how Scotland remembers its imperial past, with what has happened in regards to the Brexit fiasco, England's utter incompetence. Scotland has managed to come off as very progressive. The SNP have been brilliant within a very terrible parliament. And what was done, what Nicola Sturgeon has done in regards to migrants, both European and non-European migrants, is exceptional in comparison to Theresa May. So there seems to be that there is this universal humanity that is acknowledged north of the border. It seems that there is this Scottish progressivism. But here's the kicker. The violence of conquest, colonialism, settlerism, enslavement, and the apprenticeships that followed after slavery was banned, all followed from the Acts of Enclosure, and all were challenged in the wars of the 1600s. A voyage in 1609, taking vagrants and those in indentured servitude, shipwrecked on Bermuda. And on Bermuda, they overthrew the gentry, and a multiracial group of people who were destined for Virginia set up themselves in an egalitarian society in which race didn't structure anything at all, right? And they united against the common enemy, who were the gentry of the time. In Britain, movements like the Levellers and the Diggers formed, fighting for suffrage, for rights to exist even if no property was held, to sanctify the commons, to end the death penalty for stealing, and to end the military servitude that they felt that they were under, especially under Cromwell, who had eyes upon Ireland. Beyond the bravado of the frightened men, there were many dissident groups, predominantly of the Christian church, but some who were charged with atheism. The women were charged with witchcraft, pursued, killed, or driven out again into the colonies. We seldom hear these stories. At the Putney debates of 1647, as the new model army under the watch of Cromwell, the rank and file, many of whom were made up of the Levellers, opposed the conquest of Ireland. To switch from servitude to the crown to the new capitalist classes, they thought, was a bridge too far. Thomas Rainbow, one of the leaders of the Levellers within the debates, said it would be a double insult for those who opposed the enclosures at home to then enact them abroad. As the eminent black historian C.L.R. James noted, it was the Levellers that led to the Parliamentary Republic of Cromwell, with the beheading of Charles I. But when Cromwell became the Leviathan, he swung for the most radical members. The revolution was for the rights of the properties. Those without would continue to be subjected to enclosures, were stripped of dignity, were forced into penury. Many were killed, many went on to become brutal colonizers. But we'll get to that in a minute. Where was Scotland in all of this? Now my knowledge, and I'm more than happy to be checked on you guys, is that Presbyterian elites feared Catholicism. And as a consequence of their fear of that parliamentarism and Cromwell, they backed the crown, right? And most of the armies that came from Scotland during that time were loyalists. And when Charles II was put back onto the throne, it was the Scots who did it first. They were right to fear the consequences of Cromwell, but wrong to back the ancient regime, because the emerging forces, the working class, the property, the masses, were the only thing that would have been there to stop the Highlanders from enclosure. There was a conservatism in Scotland, one understood as defensive because of the capitalist classes. It was calculated the monarchy were the devil they knew. This pragmatism didn't pay off. Highland armies fought against those who would have stopped the enclosure, and fundamentally shift away from the extractivist economies that were taking hold at the time. Instead, the Highlands and the clan systems had their lives violently altered. A conservatism killed the possibility of a radical revolution, a return to a communalism or a progression to a communism. With the unearthing of the Putney debates, it became clear that it wasn't just a battle for parliament, and it wasn't just a battle for the new capitalist classes. The propertialists were there, and they were saying, we have rights even if we don't hold land. The parliamentarians representing the mercantile classes and the new industrial classes imposed their private property, wiped out the central voices, brutally dealt with rebellions, and though many deserted, Ireland was invaded despite protestations from the rank and file. The Army Council debated when they got there whether to eradicate the natives or merely divest them of their estates. The logic of conquest and colonialism found its roots in Ireland. And when he was met with resistance, Cromwell decreed every 10th man of the soldiers be killed and the rest be shipped off to Barbados. To pay for the military campaign in Ireland, Cromwell imposed fixed enclosures, turning pastures into farms, and the egalitarianism of the old rural life was torn apart in all areas of his and England's extending dominion. Colonialism was the way of dealing with the rabble, the proletarians who couldn't play their role without threatening to the social order. Go to the colonies, serve your time, or die. The poor labelled vagrants, the workers who had been torn from rural life and dropped into the cities and couldn't find meaningful existence, were oftentimes snatched up to be sent to the colonies. Children were. The word kidnap derives from these processes. Prisons were emptied, their population sent to Barbados. Sex workers were seized from the streets of London and sent to the Caribbean solely to breed. Proletarians in the true sense of the word. The colonisation of Ireland saw the industrialisation of labour for England, something it would take to a sickening nadir in the transatlantic slave trade. But this was the period before slavery had been institutionalised and before it became the bedrock of the British Caribbean. With the colonisation of Ireland, it is estimated that 34,000 Irish were shipped to the Caribbean for work in the plantations, with 8,000 in Barbados alone by the mid-1950s. In 1649, they organised a rebellion. Hundreds were arrested, many tortured, and 18 were executed. The first servants to escape from the colonies formed armies and went to the mountains. They called themselves the Maroons. The first noted Maroons in history were multiracial. The threat of unity between oppressed groups led to the construction of race. It was used to divide oppressed peoples, to stratify social order, and maintain the profit margins that fueled themselves through murder and brutal extraction. In 1649, the institution of slavery became British on the River Gambia, where the royalists and parliamentarians who fought against each other at home, fearing the Dutch, worked together. By 1660, with the monarchy reintroduced, it became the Royal African Company. And through the masses of wealth that they amassed through this process, they reconciled. In the House of Commons, people spoke against the unchristian and barbarous usage of humans, but then they limited the scope of humanity. Blacks were lesser humans. The ideal of Europe became a sleight of hand, a trick, a sick joke. Morality worked for only those to be deemed fully human. Natives were flora and fauna, blacks were savages. Slavery and servitude were imposed, but rebellion never stopped. Just the history stopped being told by white people. It became black history, their history, something you performatively tolerate for a month. But this is our history, and it is how we became white, and no matter the social class, whiteness put you a cut above. The key mechanism of colonialism was to make the servants, who were predominantly Irish, police the enslaved. Legislation subdivided multiracial resistance. The institution of slavery replaced indentured servitude and bred rebellions across cultural and ethnic lines. The institution of slavery meant that the conditions arose that necessitating immigration, when it came to the Highlands, meant that the dispossessed could take the possessions of others. They could claim the lands of Native Americans, Canadians, New Zealanders, Australians. They could become the overseers overseas. I take it while that's the flags and the Taurus season are flown there. Race became the modality through which classes experienced, to quote Stuart Hall. There were certain jobs and lifestyles that one who identified as white would never have to do. Rule Britannia and all that. The story of the Highlanders became one of their dispossession, and the story of pioneering in the New World, for their heroism, their tenacity, their unbreakable spirit. But the resistance in the Caribbean never stopped, and from start to finish, it was a struggle for the universality that Europe and Scots professed in their enlightenment, but annihilated in the Caribbean. When the universals of humanity were emphatically stated with the Haitian Revolution of 1804, the colonial powers united to destroy it. They accepted the end of slavery in Haiti for reparations. The debt remains the reason that Haiti stands as the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. Haiti showed what was possible, and for that it would be punished. From the very beginning, when the downtrodden from across the world were brought to the Caribbean, and then when the black skin was branded, the rights of universal humanity were denied, and back-breaking extraction and labor continued. On the ships, on the docks, in the plantations, people had fought to be free, but to overthrow the regime, as they'd done in Haiti, was too inspiring. Such inspiration could not be accepted. The leader of the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture, was assassinated. The French tricked him, killed him, and then negotiated the reparations that would lead them to accept that France's crown jewel was gone. It remains the reason Haiti is the poorest nation. It rippled through the Caribbean, as C.L.R. James noted. It forced the end of slavery in Britain, who was stretched to breaking point in the Caribbean. And they were making most of their money through India at the time. So Britain became abolitionist. British slavers kept flying the British flag 50 years after the official end of slavery, but without royal ratification. But it used this morality and Wilberforce to castigate the French, who were doing better than it in the Caribbean. And as C.L.R. James notes, it was only force that changed the British hand, and it was only profit margins that meant that newfound morality had any loft whatsoever. The end of slavery was not the end of colonialism, and the brutal extractivist economics were maintained. So when Paul Bogle stood up and was the leader of the Morant Bay Uprising, demanding political rights for black Jamaicans, he was made an example of and hung by British authorities. So the name of the publishing house that inspired this here, Bogle Overture, becomes clear. It is a celebration of the heroes who stood up for themselves, for their people and humanity. Their struggles would inspire others. Powerful leaders and visionaries like Walter Rodney. Rodney, whose radical politics got him banned from Jamaica, sparking Bogle Overture into being, was killed before he could even get to power. He was too strong a mind and personality to let it continue. People like Maurice Bishop, another person who was there foundationally to the setting up of Bogle Overture, would go on to become the Prime Minister of Grenada with the New Jewel movement. Again, he was killed. After the Marines invaded, Reagan took vengeance on Bishop, who proclaimed that Grenada was nobody's backyard. The world was structured through race, and through race it was acceptable to kill the prophets for profit. Eric and Jessica Huntley, in the spirit of Marcus Garvey, sought to emancipate their people from mental slavery. They sold many of the books you see here. They knew, as we do, the function of knowledge is to liberate. Thank you.